Hi, this is Ted, and for the next hour, you'll be listening to a reading of articles and features from the Monday, February 16th New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we'll start with this one. Sorry, my voice isn't good. With latest rollback, the U.S. essentially has no clean car rules. This is by Hiroko Tabuchi. The momentous end to the federal government's legal authority to fight climate change makes it official. The United States will essentially have no laws on the books that enforce how efficient America's passenger cars and trucks should be. That's the practical result of the Trump administration's year-long parade of regulatory rollbacks, capped on Thursday by its killing of the endangerment finding, the scientific determination that required the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate greenhouse gases because of the threat to human health. The U.S. no longer has emission standards of any meaning, said Margot Ode, who served as the EPA's top vehicle emissions regulator under 3 presidents and has since advised both automakers and environmental groups. Nothing, zero, she added. Not many countries have zero. Transportation is the largest single source of greenhouse gases in the U.S. Car buyers could still vote with their wallets, demanding more fuel-efficient cars. California has vowed to sue to maintain stricter standards, and the Department of Transportation still regulates fuel economy under rules meant to conserve oil. But last year, the Trump administration proposed weakening the fuel economy standards to largely irrelevant levels. The Republican-controlled Congress also set civil penalties for violations at $0, essentially making them voluntary for automakers. In addition, Congress last year blocked California's clean car rules. The bottom line is that the United States is set to stand apart from a majority of the world's industrialized nations, which have mandatory fuel economy or greenhouse gas tailpipe emissions rules. The EPA still regulates tailpipe emissions of specific pollutants like nitrogen oxides. The Biden administration had sought to tighten limits on emissions to encourage automakers to sell more non-polluting electric vehicles. The Trump administration's elimination of the endangerment finding on Thursday is expected to face fierce legal challenges from environmental groups and others. The endangerment finding was a 2009 scientific conclusion that greenhouse gas emissions pose a danger to Americans' health and welfare. It provided the foundation to justify federal regulations that limit carbon dioxide, methane, and other pollution, including from cars. If the EPA's decision holds, it could increase the country's greenhouse gas emissions by 10% over the next 30 years, according to the Environmental Defense Fund. Greenhouse emissions are the main driver of global climate change, which in turn is intensifying heat waves, drought, hurricanes, and floods, while also melting glaciers and causing sea levels to rise. Lee Zeldin, the EPA administrator, called the end of the finding the largest single deregulatory action in the history of the United States. He accused Democrats of having launched an ideological crusade on climate change that had strangled entire sectors of the U.S. economy, particularly the auto industry, which has struggled to sell electric vehicles. Climate concerns aside, it's unclear whether the U.S. auto industry will ultimately benefit from the elimination of emissions and fuel efficiency regulations. The move could leave American automakers even more dominated by gas-guzzling trucks and sport utility vehicles, experts said, as China and other nations continue to shift toward cleaner electric cars. That could leave them at a competitive disadvantage in coming years. Our automakers are not going to survive, Mrs. Ode predicted. John Bozzella, the president of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which represents automakers in the U.S., has declined to say whether he supports the end of the endangerment finding. But he did say in a statement that the move would correct some of the unachievable emissions regulations enacted under the previous administration. Trump has swung back and forth on his opinion of electric vehicles. During the 2024 presidential campaign, he said electric cars would kill America's auto industry, but he appeared to at least temporarily soften his stance at the urging of Elon Musk, the chief executive of Tesla and his one-time close advisor. In March, he said he would buy a Tesla. Globally, the push is in exactly the opposite direction, in the direction of electrifying vehicles, said Ann Carlson, a president at UCLA School of Law, who served under Joseph Biden as acting administrator of National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the transportation department agency that sets fuel efficiency standards. But now they're saying no standards whatsoever, she said. For 17 years, the EPA worked in tandem with the Department of Transportation, with the EPA regulating carbon dioxide emissions to protect health, and the Transportation Department governing how much fuel a car can burn to conserve fuel. The endangerment finding had allowed the EPA in recent years to push standards more aggressively than possible using fuel economy rules alone, setting targets so low they would eventually have become virtually impossible for gasoline engines to meet. The EPA also had the authority, for example, to issue stop sale orders if an automaker failed to meet standards, preventing them from selling certain cars until the issue was resolved. The first Trump administration had moved to weaken both the tailpipe emissions and fuel economy standards. Mr. Biden had then reversed course, strengthening them. But now that the second Trump administration has eliminated the EPA's underlying authority to regulate greenhouse gases, another reversal by a future administration could be more difficult. Even if a new administration came in and was inclined to regulate greenhouse gases, it would take years to reissue and defend the endangerment finding, said Professor Carlson. And in the meantime, they would have no authority to write any new greenhouse gas regulations. The remaining rules, such as the fuel efficiency requirements, could also be weakened. In December, the Trump administration proposed resetting the Transportation Department standard to require automakers to achieve an average of 34.5 miles per gallon for the full lineup of cars they sell by 2031. The Biden-era target was closer to 50 miles per gallon. These new standards would be less stringent than those in the European Union, as well as those of countries like China, Japan, and India. Congress's separate decision to eliminate fines for failure to comply with efficiency standards also makes the rules voluntary, saving automakers significant compliance costs. Any resulting shift by American automakers toward gas guzzlers that can't be sold in Europe or China could further isolate the U.S. market, and the U.S. would increasingly cede the future of automotive technology to Chinese electric vehicle giants like BYD. We're an outlier now, said Joshua Lin, a professor at the University of Maryland who studies environmental policies and the transportation sector. Those larger trucks and SUVs tend to make them more money, he said. But if they want to compete in Europe or East Asia, they really need to be able to produce these EVs. A divergence in tailpipe emissions rules could emerge domestically. California has promised a court challenge, saying the state would fight to continue to regulate greenhouse gases. Other states are expected to follow California's lead. To have a patchwork of systems makes it really hard for companies that do business in 50 states, let alone in other countries, said Ann Kelly, the vice president of government relations at Ceres, an advocacy group that works with businesses on their sustainability plans. There is no world in which this is helpful for the auto industry. Matthew Beecham, a senior research analyst at S&P Global Mobility, an automotive company, said that given the uncertainties, automakers were likely to hedge their bets. They might expand their gasoline car lineups, he said, but most likely would not abandon electrification completely. And despite no penalties for violating the remaining fuel economy standards, There was unlikely to be wholesale law breaking, he said, because state rules and investor scrutiny could keep companies in check. Still, a shift toward larger gasoline models could ultimately undermine their competitiveness in an intensifying global EV race. Car makers around the world are scrambling to secure enough EV batteries, for example, and that race penalizes laggers, he said. While the EPA continues to regulate pollutants like nitrogen oxides that pose direct threats to human health, it is now also seeking to weaken those rules. Aaron Szabo, the EPA's air quality chief, wrote in an opinion article published by The Hill in December that rolling back those rules would reduce red tape and bring common sense back to rulemaking. The move to roll back regulations increases choices and lowers the price of cars, he said. But vehicles that burn more fuel cost car owners more at the pump, said Daniel Becker, director of Safe Climate Transport Campaign. The Trump administration is telling American manufacturers, you guys go build gasoline cars, he said. The Chinese government is telling its manufacturers, you go build the advanced vehicles that are going to take over the world. And another environmental story. Teddy Roosevelt's family urges GOP to protect public lands. By Maxine Josoloff. Ted Roosevelt IV doesn't like to put words in a dead man's mouth, but he's pretty sure that President Theodore Roosevelt, his great-grandfather, would have been appalled by an effort by House Republicans to allow mining near an expensive wilderness in Minnesota. So he and several relatives recently wrote to Republican senators urging them against allowing mining upstream from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, a vast preserve of glacial lakes and boreal forests crisscrossed by canoe routes and hiking trails. It was a remarkable rebuke of the Republican Party's apparent retreat from the environmental ethos of Theodore Roosevelt, who protected around 230 million acres of public lands during his presidency. It's not just this administration, it's the GOP collectively that is not as concerned about conservation as it should be, said Ted Roosevelt IV, 83, in a recent interview. Mr. Roosevelt, a Manhattan-based investment banker and lifelong moderate Republican, traveled to Washington last week to meet with senators and their staff members about the Boundary Waters. His conservative credentials and his family's last name got him through the doors of several offices, although he declined to say which ones. Off the top of his head, Mr. Roosevelt rattled off several conservation efforts by Republican presidents. Ulysses Grant established Yellowstone as the first national park. Abraham Lincoln protected Yosemite Valley by giving it to California as the first state park. And most recently, George W. Bush created a marine national monument in the Pacific Ocean, southwest of Hawaii. I don't see any Republican leadership on that scale today, said Mr. Roosevelt. President Trump, who has indicated that he will sign the measure to allow mining near the Boundary Waters, has sought to increase oil and gas drilling, mining, and other industrial activities on public lands and waters across the country. His administration plans to permit new oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska and across nearly 1.3 billion acres of U.S. coastal waters. There's never been a president with zero interest in protecting the natural world until Donald Trump, said Douglas Brinkley, a presidential historian at Rice University. The signers of the letter included two other great-grandsons of Theodore Roosevelt, Tweed Roosevelt, a businessman and family historian, and Mark Roosevelt, a one-time Democratic nominee for governor of Massachusetts. Kermit Roosevelt III, a law professor and a great-great-grandson of the former president, also signed. TR was active in preserving our greatest wilderness terrain on both the east and west coasts. It became one of the greatest enduring legacies of his life, the four Roosevelts wrote to senators. It is now time for all of you to get in the arena with him, they wrote, a reference to a famous quote from the former president about the value of fighting valiantly for worthy causes. The descendants added that they represented all three branches of Theodore Roosevelt's family, stemming from his sons Archie, Kermit, and Ted. The four of us below have never collectively co-signed a letter together, which should give an indication of how strongly we support voting no on this, they wrote. Kermit Roosevelt III declined to comment for this article, saying in an email that he would prefer just to let the letter speak for itself. The other two Roosevelts did not immediately respond to requests for comment. People might not associate Theodore Roosevelt, who was born in New York City and hunted bison across the American West, with wilderness in Minnesota. But he established the Superior National Forest, which encompasses 3 million acres in the state and includes the Boundary Waters in one of his final acts as president. The Boundary Waters has been at the center of a fierce dispute over a proposed copper and nickel mine for more than a decade. Twin Metals Minnesota, a subsidiary of the Chilean mining company Antofagasta, wants to build the underground mine in Ely, just upstream from the wilderness area. And I have to mention that you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Conservationists have fought to block the project, saying its operation could contaminate the region's interconnected lakes and streams with heavy metals and sulfuric acid. They scored a victory in 2023 when the Biden administration imposed a 20-year moratorium on mining across more than 225,000 acres of the Superior National Forest. But the House this month passed a resolution from Representative Pete Stauber, a Republican of Minnesota, that would overturn the moratorium. Senate Republicans plan to pass the measure in the coming weeks with a simple majority vote rather than the 60-vote threshold required for many types of legislation. Since both senators from Minnesota are Democrats, it is unclear which Senate Republican would sponsor the measure. Representatives for Senator John Thune, who's a Republican from South Dakota and the majority leader, did not respond to a request for comment. Representatives for Twin Metals Minnesota and Mr. Stauber also did not return requests for comment. Ryan Callahan, the chief executive of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, a nonprofit group that wants to preserve access to the Boundary Waters for hunting and fishing, said he was grateful to have the Roosevelts on his side in the Senate fight. That name sure carries a lot of weight with a lot of people, he said. In recent years, some scholars have written that Theodore Roosevelt's views and attitudes toward conservation were racist by modern standards. He called white people the forward race in a 1905 speech, and his creation of national parks often forcibly displaced Native Americans from lands that they had stewarded for generations. But the 26th president continues to command broad respect among figures, including the top Trump administration official responsible for overseeing public lands. Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, frequently invokes Theodore Roosevelt's conservation legacy in speeches, social media posts, and emails to Interior Department employees. While serving as the governor of North Dakota, Mr. Burgum also championed the construction of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in Medora, North Dakota. The library is set to open on July 4th to mark America's 250th birthday, an occasion that the four Roosevelts highlighted in their letter. Quote, on Independence Day, 3 pillars of TR's life will take central stage: leadership, conservation, and citizenship. It's one thing for politicians to say they believe in these 3 pillars, and it's quite another to act that way. And here's an interesting article about developments in China. And I apologize in advance for my pronunciation of Chinese names. The article is, In Xi's Purge of the Military, A Search for Absolute Loyalty, by Lily Kuo. When Xi Jinping rang in the new year from Beijing, he called on China to remember the legacy of Yan'an, the rural stronghold where Mao Zedong transformed revolutionary guerrilla fighters into a disciplined force under his command that would go on to take the country. It may have been a hint of what was to come. Yan'an was also where Mao Zedong launched his party's first major, quote, rectification, a campaign of political terror that eliminated rivals and cemented his absolute authority over the party. 3 weeks after Mr. Xi's speech, China effectively purged the military's top commander, General Yang Yujia, who had once been seen as a confidant of Mr. Xi's. Like Mao, Mr. Xi is pursuing a kind of spiritual renewal of the party and the military he commands, what he calls constant self-revolution. And like Mao, that has taken the form of constant purging of enemies, associates, and now those in his inner circle too. It is a new level of ruthlessness for a man who has already concentrated power in himself to a degree not seen since Mao. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Xi has essentially ousted 5 of the 6 generals in China's top military body, the Central Military Commission, which controls China's armed forces. Only 2 members are left, Mr. Xi himself and a vice chairman who has overseen the purges. It is quite astonishing, said Yu Gang, a retired colonel of the People's Liberation Army. In the weeks after, Chinese officials have offered little explanation as they sought to project normalcy. But Mr. Xi hosted foreign leaders in Beijing and convened a meeting with party officials on policy work. On Wednesday, he met with military units by video conference and conveyed his greetings for the Lunar New Year. Acknowledging that the past year had been very unusual and extraordinary, Mr. Xi sought to show that the rank and file were loyal to him, saying that the troops were still completely reliable and trustworthy. Online discussion has been restricted as social media platforms filter search results and comments related to General Zhang. The few official editorials released on the subject hark back to the campaign of ideological cleansing first modeled at Yan'an and suggest that at the heart of the ouster is Mr. Xi's control over the military, a powerful empire within the party. A front-page editorial in the People's Liberation Army Daily characterized the investigation as a necessary hygiene, a process of uprooting sick trees and removing hidden cancer so that the military would be reforged and reformed. Another editorial in the same paper described Mr. Xi's leadership as the source of strength, direction, and future for the military. Mr. Xi believes he needs to build a foundation of absolute ideological unity and personal loyalty for future battles, wrote John Garneau, a founder of Garneau Global, a geopolitical risk advisory firm. He noted that the language used by the party showed that Mr. Xi was drawing on Maoist and Stalinist playbooks absorbed in his youth as the son of a revolutionary fighter. Over his 13 years in power, Xi has often cited Yan'an, the Communist Party's main revolutionary base until 1948, as inspiration for his own culling of cadres, as well as a way to signal his own supreme authority in the party in the tradition of Mao. After Xi secured a 3rd term as head of the party, breaking with precedent, he visited the city in the northwest province of Shanxi with his top officials. He and General Zhang also made the pilgrimage to Yan'an in 2024 for a meeting heavy with symbolism on political work in the Chinese military. Xi exhorted the senior military officers, which included 3 other senior generals that he would later also purge, to remember their original revolutionary mission. Visiting the former residences of revolutionary leaders like Mao and Zhou Enlai on that trip, he declared the importance of the party's absolute leadership over the military. For Xi Jinping, he sees that legacy and that kind of campaign as one of the party's greatest treasures. He wants to go back to history and use those methods, said Joseph Torgen, a historian of the Chinese Communist Party at American University in Washington. He thinks he can do it right. Securing control over the People's Liberation Army has been the key challenge of every leader since Mao, who immortalized its importance by declaring that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Colonel Yue argued that Mr. Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, struggled to manage the military and had been outmaneuvered by 2 vice chairmen of the commission. We've had this lesson before, Colonel Yu said. who argued that General Zhang may have tried and failed to weaken Xi's hold over the military. The smooth takedown of General Zhang, he said, shows how impossible it is to shake the leadership of Xi Jinping. The attempt to undermine the power didn't succeed. Instead, it resulted in a disastrous outcome, he said. Since Xi came to power in 2012, he has overseen an intense campaign to clean up the military, where corruption had been on the rise since market reforms in the 1980s, and his military spending soared. He sees absolute loyalty as vital to one of his key goals of building a 21st century combat-ready force capable of defending China's interests, like its claim over Taiwan. And as Beijing competes more directly with the United States, ensuring the military's loyalty in times of crisis and possible conflict is even more important. The party must always command the gun, never the other way around, said the Chinese military expert Song Zhongping. When Xi talks about the spirit of Yan'an, he glosses over details of the purging of thousands of party members at Yan'an through psychologically brutal sessions of self-criticism that led some to suicide. Xi uses some of those methods of political indoctrination, including mandating study sessions of his personalized doctrine, Xi Jinping thought, and encouraging the reporting of one's peers or superiors for violating Xi's edicts. It turns the whole party into a trial of mutual reporting, so no one can be trusted. Not your parents, not your superiors, no one. His type of regime needs constant enemies and purges to maintain fear. Xi's rectification campaign, while not as bloody or extreme as Mao's, extends across the party apparatus, targeting graft as well as perceived disloyalty. Last year, 983,000 officials were punished for violating party rules, the highest number on record, according to data released by the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. The sudden removal of senior officials with no explanation has become a hallmark of Xi's rule, inspiring uncertainty and fear among Chinese officials in what analysts say is either a sign of his increasing paranoia or a tactic to keep the leader's enemies, as well as his allies, guessing. Rather than quietly retire, General Zhang at the next leadership transition in 2027, Mr. Xi chose to publicly and loudly disown him. This purge manifests a position of strength, said Yun Sun, director of the China program at the Stimson Center in Washington. Xi can move his finger and remove the most powerful leader of the Chinese military. Something perhaps a little lighter, but also frightening. Why an AI video of Tom Cruise battling Brad Pitt spooked Hollywood, by Derek Bryson Taylor. It took only a 15-second clip of Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt duking it out on a crumbling rooftop at twilight to draw swift outrage and sizable fear from Hollywood over the last few days. The widely circulated video was created by the Irish director Ruairi Robinson using Seedance 2.0, a powerful artificial intelligence video generation tool owned by the Chinese technology company ByteDance. It had plenty of the bells and whistles of a big-budget Hollywood film, sweeping camera angles, stunt choreography, crisp sound effects, and haunting music. With a 2-sentence prompt and the click of a button, Seedance had produced a stunningly realistic result that was a drastic improvement over previously generated artificial intelligence videos, often shoddy clips known as AI slop. This video was so convincing that it drew near immediate condemnation from some of Hollywood's top organizations and companies. Rhett Reese, a scriptwriter known for his Deadpool films, said in an interview that the Cruise Pitt video had sent a cold shiver up his spine. For all of us who work in the industry and devoted our careers and lives to it, I just think it's nothing short of terrifying, he said. I could just see it costing jobs all over the place. ByteDance released Seedance 2 last week, nearly 2 months after a previous version had failed to prompt much anger. A news release from the company praised the updated tool's physical accuracy, realism, and controllability, which it said was suitable for the needs of professional-grade creative scenarios. The creation process, the release went on, is more natural and efficient, allowing users to control their creations like a true director. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Users promptly flocked to the platform to spin up their own content. An alternate ending to Game of Thrones went viral, as did a video of the notoriously beefing rappers Kendrick Lamar and Drake burying the hatchet on The Tonight Show, and one of Samara Morgan, the vengeful girl in the Ring horror films, emerging from an old television set to pet a cat. Robinson himself posted additional videos, including of Pitt and Cruz battling a robot, and of Pitt sparring with a sword-wielding zombie ninja. At the same time, and here is an article, an essay called Confessions of a Former Body Positivity Influencer. Everyone is talking about GLP-1s. They've become a game changer for losing weight and treating a spectrum of health issues. Today, 18% of adults say they've taken a GLP-1 drug, a proportion that may increase if the Trump administration makes good on its plans to lower prices for the medications. Before GLP-1s came onto the scene, body positivity was a years-long cultural mandate, a counter-movement to the toxic beauty standards and weight loss frenzy that defined the early 2000s. But amid this current weight loss revolution, that movement is facing an existential crisis. While some body positivity advocates have embraced weight loss drugs, others have rejected them, fearing that thin is now back in and with it, fat phobia. Some within the movement have also downplayed the health risks linked to obesity and even criticized those who choose to lose weight, prompting accusations of ignoring medical consensus. So is it possible to love your body and still want to change it? That's what the former body positivity influencer Gabriela Lascano argues in the opinion video. Recounting her journey from body positivity champion to critic, she describes how a well-intentioned movement has over time become self-destructive with potentially fatal consequences. I started to wonder if loving myself at any size had become an excuse to ignore how big I was getting, she says. But there's a middle ground, she argues, one that doesn't require a return to the early 2000s, but a move toward what she considers true body positivity. It's dumb. And here's an essay by Frank Bruni called Pam Bondi and Trump's Insult Politics. I imagine Pam Bondi getting ready for one of her appearances on Capitol Hill by practicing in front of a mirror. She hones her glare, she perfects her sneer, she rehearses her lines, such as they are. Washed up loser lawyer. That's for Representative Jamie Raskin, Democrat of Maryland. What the phrase lacks in poetry, it makes up for in pithiness. It's just 4 short words, 2 of them conveniently conjoined with a hyphen. Even Bondi can remember that much. Failed politician. That's for Representative Thomas Massie, Republican of Kentucky. 2 words. Insults are all about efficiency. But it's not Bondi's script that matters most, it's her voice. And the Attorney General got the tone of it, the poison in it, just right when she spat those put-downs at those men during her testimony before a House panel last week. She didn't merely ooze contempt, she gushed it, so that all she communicated during more than 4 hours of nasty exchanges was how loathsome she found her interrogators, which was obviously her goal. Her mission, I can't get it out of my mind. But then, I never stopped thinking about her identical performance before a Senate panel last October. Both crystallized what is arguably the defining trait of the second Trump administration, a bearing and bullying that casts a noxious haze over all public discourse, which was already plenty polluted. This crew, Bondi, Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance, Trump himself, don't want to win opponents' favor. They don't even want to win the argument. Why sweat the delicate art of persuasion when you can use the brute force of condemnation? Comity and conciliation are a slog, they're for suckers. Contempt is Victor's ready, heady prerogative. It's also what the MAGA movement was supposed to be rebelling against. Many people who flocked to Trump in all his spite and willful destructiveness were protesting the condescension and derision of the Democratic elite, who they felt held them in contempt. They were responding to Barack Obama's lament about embittered Americans who cling to their guns or religion. They were reacting to Hillary Clinton's jibe about the basket of deplorables. At least that's one origin theory, one narrative thread. But Trump, his aides, and many of his supporters haven't purged contempt from our politics. They've mainstreamed it, purified it, industrialized it. It's their push-a-button pushback against everyone who challenges them and any circumstances that threaten to undermine them, an all-purpose way to pivot from the substance of a situation to an evasive and obfuscating ill will, envelop everything in indiscriminate animosity, and nothing real survives. That's what Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, and Miller, the impresario of ugliness, did when federal agents killed protesters in Minneapolis. Smear first, ask questions later, or better yet, never. Contempt is the default setting for Vance's crude comments, to which George Will devoted much of a recent column in the Washington Post. It's not easy being transgressive in an era when there are few norms remaining to transgress, wrote Will of the climate Vance inhabits. Undaunted, he tries. Performative politics is almost the only politics on offer nowadays. But must it be a coarseness and flippancy competition? For Vance, Bondi, and company, yes, it must, because that's a contest they can win. Vance has only a scintilla of the experience that many previous vice presidents had, but he can best them in contemptuousness. Pete Hegseth's resume pales next to those of many defense secretaries before him, but he can radiate a magnitude of disgust with perceived adversaries that they never did. The brazen bunch of them model a new idea and exercise of strength, which to them isn't something achieved and fortified by learning from your mistakes. It's something that puts you in a position to tell others that the mistakes are theirs. Call them names and lick your chops as you do. It doesn't empower you to reach out to your opponents or show them mercy. Mercy is what you make them beg for, so you can savor the pleasure of denying it. And the way you consolidate and perpetuate power is by so thoroughly demonizing those opponents, by blasting so much contempt at them, that your own failures, corruption, and cruelty become irrelevant. You needn't answer for your fatal thuggery in Minneapolis if you can render its casualties sufficiently contemptible. You needn't answer questions from a washed-up loser lawyer or a failed politician at all. Bondi came into that hearing last week as a joke, a disgrace, the titular head of a Justice Department that had seen its politically motivated prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James dismissed by a federal judge, its requested indictment of 6 Democratic lawmakers rejected by a federal grand jury, its handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files exposed as a travesty. What she should have been feeling and projecting was humiliation. She opted for contempt. It's the Trumpian way. But is it the American one? Has the country sunk quite this far? I don't think so. She and her fellow insult mongers aren't owning the libs. They're beclowning themselves. And it's a repellent circus. and you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And we'll conclude with an essay by Congressman Ro Khanna, about Congressman Ro Khanna by Ezra Klein. It's called Ro Khanna is Shaken by What He's Learned from the Epstein Files. Ro Khanna's congressional career has been an ongoing attempt to reconcile what others might see as irreconcilable. He represents a swath of Silicon Valley that includes the headquarters of NVIDIA and Intel. He won his seat in 2016 with endorsements from tech titans like Sundar Pichai, Eric Schmidt, and Mark Andreessen. He is himself one of the richest members of the House, but he is also a stalwart of the House Progressive Caucus, was the co-chair of the 2020 presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders, and is backing a proposed wealth tax in California. To Khanna, there was no contradiction here, just a single polity that had to be reminded of its common interests. We have to make sure every American has a stake in the success of Silicon Valley, and that Silicon Valley doesn't become an island unto itself, he told me in 2019. Or we're going to see a rebellion against some of the forces that I think are good for society. Now he may have reached the end of what can be reconciled. Back in July, Khanna, along with Representative Thomas Massie, a Kentucky Republican, introduced the Epstein Files Transparency Act. He and Massie were eventually joined by MAGA luminaries like Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Nancy Mace, and together they defied Trump and Speaker Mike Johnson and used a discharge petition to force the bill to the House floor, where it passed overwhelmingly. With millions of files now released, Khanna sounds shaken by what he's learned and what he hasn't. About 3.5 million pages of emails, text messages, and court records have been released, but the government has announced that in total more than 6 million pages exist. What the public has seen was first reviewed and redacted by lawyers from Pam Bondi's Department of Justice. Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General overseeing the process, was previously one of Trump's personal lawyers. We still don't have the most potent thing, which is the survivors' statements to the FBI over who raped them and who committed these acts, Khanna told me on Tuesday. The result is we know much more about Epstein's network than we did before, but not much more about the crimes he committed or who he may have committed them with. The Department of Justice and the FBI say Epstein harmed over 1,000 victims. Did he really do all of that alone with just the help of Ghislaine Maxwell? Much of what we want to know would not have been put in emails by Epstein or his friends. Send me a number to call. I don't like records of these conversations, Epstein wrote to Steve Tisch, the billionaire co-owner of the New York Giants. There are constant references, even in the documents we have seen, to secrets and experiences that cannot be shared. I keep thinking of the 50th birthday note to Epstein that appears to be signed by Trump. May every day be another wonderful secret. What were those secrets exactly? But there is much more that the Epstein files do reveal. Epstein's network crossed the categories we're used to using to divvy up American life. He was chummy with Noam Chomsky and Peter Thiel, with Steve Bannon and Catherine Rumler, Barack Obama's White House counsel, with Deepak Chopra and Howard Lutnick. This is not a network bounded by politics or industry or place. I have long been mystified by how Epstein kept so many different kinds of people close, and how he did so long after he became a risk to those around him. The files from that perspective are clarifying. Epstein emerges as a broker of money, introductions, information, and human beings. He has a talent for sniffing out what his correspondents want most. The rich want to be taken seriously. The not-so-rich want the trappings of wealth. Many of the men wanted sex, and everyone wanted connections. To read the files is to watch Epstein calibrating his correspondents' desires in real time. In September 2013, he writes Elon Musk to say that the opening of the General Assembly has many interesting people coming to the House. Musk is unimpressed. Flying to New York to see UN diplomats do nothing would be an unwise use of time, he responds. Epstein changes tack. Do you think I'm retarded, he shoots back. No one over 25 and all very cute. Musk appears to have ignored Epstein's invitation. What Epstein is always offering in all directions is connections to the rest of his network. A 2014 email exchange with Rumler is particularly bald-faced. Most girls do not have to worry about this crap, she writes in a conversation in which she appears to be weighing whether to accept being nominated for Attorney General. What follows is a note that appears to combine Epstein joking about their shared knowledge of his abuses, he was then a convicted sex offender, and then dangling a dazzling array of contacts. Girls, responds Epstein. Careful, I will renew an old habit. This week, Thiel, Summers, Bill Burns, Gordon Brown, Jagland, Council of Europe and Nobel Chairman, Mongolia President, Hardeep Puri, Boris Gates, Jabor, Sultan, Koslin, Leon Black, Woody, you are a welcome guest at any. Rumler's dry response was, doesn't look like you are prioritizing your schedule very effectively. Epstein is constantly tossing out offers. Would Peter Thiel like to have dinner with Noam Chomsky? Would Steve Bannon like to meet Sebastian Kurz, then the Chancellor of Austria? Would Ariana de Rothschild like to have dinner with Bill Gates? Would Larry Summers like to have dinner with Ehud Barak? Would Steve Tisch like to meet a woman whose name I'll leave out, but whom Epstein describes as Tahitian, speaks mostly French, exotic? Epstein had money, much of it scammed off others, but connections were his most universal currency, and their breadth was self-reinforcing. Plenty of people saw Epstein for what he was and stayed far away. But for others, his proximity to the rich and the powerful were evidence that whatever he had done, it couldn't be that bad. After all, look who he was dining with. The network made Epstein both legitimate and valuable. It enabled his abuses and, for a time, insulated him from their consequences. The Times investigation into Epstein's relationship with J.P. Morgan Chase paints a particularly clear picture of how Epstein used his network to protect himself from potential consequences. Epstein's pattern of cash withdrawals and transfers raised internal suspicions at the bank about sex trafficking. His conviction for soliciting a minor would seem to confirm those fears, but Epstein proved himself so valuable to J.P. Morgan, connecting the bank to Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem and Sergey Brin, and helping it find its way into the hedge fund business, that the institution overrode its own doubts to keep him as a client for years. The bank eventually cut ties with him, but right up until the end, his internal allies were arguing that he was still clearly well respected and trusted by some of the richest people in the world. How could they be wrong? These billionaires, these super elites, these super lawyers are working on a whole different kind of system. Anand Giridharadas, author of Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world, told me. Their system has to do with how loaded with connections you are in this network, how high your stock is on a given day in this network. What Epstein figured out was how to game this. He figured out the vulnerability of this entire network, which is that these people are actually not that serious about character. In fact, character may be a liability for some of them, may be an unnecessary source of friction. Khanna has begun to speak of an Epstein class, his term for the rich and powerful people who act and think like they're above the law and perhaps above morality. At first, I struggled a bit with Khanna's coinage. What makes Epstein specifically loathsome is his pedophilia, and how many in his network really knew of that side of his life. But the more I read the files, the harder I found it to deny the class solidarity evident within them. Epstein's predilections were no secret. Quote, it's even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side, Trump told New York Magazine in 2002. The choice was made by many to overlook or disbelieve them. In 2008, Epstein was convicted of soliciting sex from a minor. I think the world of you, and I feel hopeless and furious about what has happened, wrote Peter Mandelson, then the European Commissioner for Trade. Jess Staley, then head of J.P. Morgan's private bank, wrote to Epstein to say, I hope you keep the island. We all may need to live there. This was during the financial crisis. It's okay, there's always room for all of you, Epstein replied. In 2023, J.P. Morgan sued Staley over what it claimed was his potential failure to alert the company to Epstein's wrongdoings. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. In 2015, the Miami Herald published a stunning investigation that identified about 80 women who say they were molested or otherwise sexually abused by Epstein from 2001 to 2006. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, emailed Epstein the next day, "You have returned to the press," he wrote. And then they went on to discuss other matters. In 2019, Steve Bannon texted Epstein a link to a Daily Beast story, Court Orders Release of Sealed Docs about Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex ring. Epstein doesn't respond, at least not by text, and Bannon follows up with, "My guy is in Israel. Can we connect him to Ehud?" Epstein's network may not have known everything, but many of them knew enough. Whether they believed his denials or didn't care about the crimes, there was a solidarity or at least a transactionalism that protected Epstein and enabled his abuses. Toward the end of our conversation, Doradus made a point I keep thinking about. Power and prestige were once conferred by land or title or family, but power today consists of your position and your number of connections and the density and quality and lucrativeness of those connections in the network. How does that change the behavior of today's elites? I just wonder if courage is a value that has suffered in a network age, because to be courageous is to break ties, Jura Doradus says. And the more valuable ties become, the more exponentially valuable more ties become, the more exponentially expensive it is to cut off that tie, to burn that bridge. It is worth emphasizing that Epstein's network, as broad as it was, remained narrow in the scheme of both American and global life. We have been offered a window into a particular slice of the global elite, the slice that chose to deeply associate itself with Jeffrey Epstein. We are not seeing the way many, many people who stayed far away from Epstein comported themselves, precisely because they are not in these files. Still, even for those who thought themselves familiar with the workings and mores of the wealthy and powerful, the files have come as a shock. For Khanna, they have forced a confrontation with the possible limits of his own project, as he understood it. "I certainly don't want pitchforks," he told me. "I don't want pitchforks even against people who are billionaires. But," he said, "I used to think, let's just have a positive vision of Medicare for all and childcare and a Marshall Plan for America. I'm more in the camp now that there has to be some accountability. You need people's faith in a democratic project. And what I'm realizing is that accountability for the elite, having some sense of justice, is essential to build trust for their broader vision." And you've been listening to a reading of articles and essays from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This is Ted. I enjoyed reading, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Have a good week. Talk to you next week.